Hi everyone. Hopefully you did your reading, and this is just a supplemental to the things you've already covered from page 56 to 66 in your text. Today we're going to be looking at the demographic transition, so hopefully this will help you better understand it. First of all, let's look at what this model is all about. As we start talking about population in this unit, seeing that it's not just that it's increasing exponentially over time, but looking at it more closely by a particular country or region, we can see that it's a lot more nuanced than that. That there's population growth and in some places even decline throughout the world, even today. However, it's not a perfect model. Nothing ever usually is. There's always flaws, and this one might be one of them in the fact that this was developed by the U.S. or in the U.S. in the 1920s and really is modeled after Western societies. So it's not that this is an absolute, but it tends to follow a pretty constant trend. So let's take a look at this and see what we can come up with. In a nutshell, basically what it's showing is the transition from a period where you have high death rates and high birth rates to one where you see low birth rates and death rates. And what that basically is going to help us understand is that we are looking at when we see population growth, there are certain factors or characteristics of a society that have occurred. And so we're going to start going in right into stage one and see why is it that we have these high birth rates. And so let's take a look. If you look at, again, if you look at the blue, that's representing the crude birth rate and then the crude death rate. And so in stage one, and pre-modern, basically this is pre-Neolithic revolution or agricultural revolution. Today, every country's at least moved into a level of stage two, at least most geographers would say. And basically what you see is the crude birth rates and crude death rates were constantly in flux. So even as we look at when the agricultural revolution took place, even though we had a more constant food supply, which that provided for societies to grow, there was always periods of drought or periods of disease or calamities that would destroy populations or affect birth rates and death rates. And so for a long time, basically most of human history, population was growing at a very steady, if unremarkable, rate. And so if we look at this, as I mentioned, disease, nutrition, basically there was a large part of the population that may not ever reach the point of being able to have children. And so in order that you had to have high birth rates in order to counteract the natural deaths that would occur. And so what was going on? If you look at what's going on in England around the 17th century, the 1600s, look what happened to the percentage chance of dying. So as you get older, it was very likely that you were not going to survive much past 10, 15. People usually died pretty early in their life. And so it was a very small percentage to survive, and that looks very different today if we look at the factors of today's society. But then in stage two, we start to see a drastic change. Notice what's happening with the crude death rates, dropping dramatically. And many think that this might be part of medicine, or even some think it's looking at the food supply. But in reality, it's really a factor of the industrial age, allowing for the rapid increase in the production of goods, and it drastically changed the world that we know. So part of it was agriculture, consistency, and understanding that being more complex, industrialization, the understanding of sanitation. We looked at that early on in the course, in the ghost maps, understanding how disease spread, what disease was, and starting to develop ways to deal with those types of issues that a human society faces, even today. If we look at the 17th century, it was a period post-Columbian food exchange. And we started to see more high-calorie foods, things that were hearty foods that you didn't have to constantly be looking for a food supply, and things that could also be stored in surplus. They understood agriculture to the point of being able to rotate, protecting the value and the nutrients in the soil, better use of breeding tactics for livestock. And then we start to see advanced technology. And so as things became more advanced, it had an impact on actual hygiene or disease. In this case, looking at more cotton led to cheaper clothing, led to better hygiene, led to less disease. Simple things that maybe we take for granted. But this industrialization was huge, and as we take the mass production and the level of wealth that was creating was allowing for not only the production of things more cheaply, but it allowed for people to look to do other things on a widespread scale, and improved just the overall wealth of most societies. And so the distribution of these things. So just as we looked at Africa today, even though the world produces lots of food, more than enough for 7 billion right now, there are parts of the world that it's not distributed. And at the time, we're not always looking at it as a global sense. Sewer, huge factor. Waterborne diseases and contagious diseases were drastically improved just with basic sanitation of these, and trying to learn and learning how to manage large populations, and understanding the impact of what hygiene is. Stage 2, you notice though that birth rates also remained high. Question to be answered. Here are some of the reasons. 1, tradition. It's what people always did. You had big families. 2, you had a lot of agriculture, that people relied on the labor that the children provided, especially if there was a disease or an injury or a reason why someone can contribute to that workload. It was sort of a safety net. Birth control was limited. You didn't have many options to prevent babies. And so, as we talked about Thomas Malthus, that is one of those inherent things. People need food, and people are going to have babies. The cost benefit. Looking at what was, by having a child, there was still a benefit to having it rather than a cost in some respects. And so as we go through this, and just kind of highlighting those things, there was still a value, and then before child labor laws, it was still something they could contribute economically. And education wasn't a big factor yet, believe it or not. Well, when we get to stage 3, you see now birth rates are dropping. In stage 3, you're going to see more mature societies. These are when you're going to see more advanced societies, the more developed countries you see today. Those that are drastically changing, and you're seeing a climb in status throughout the world. And what a big factor of this becomes is the decrease in birth rates. And so, things that become factors: policy. Treatment of women, really having freedom and choice, and being empowered to not have kids and also be educated, so they contribute on a greater scale and economically. You have cities where it's not easy. As more and more people move to the cities, it was less likely for people to be on a farm and need those extra hands, and it's more expensive to have a place, a living space that would support large families. Also, education. As people saw the value of education, you couldn't provide those kind of resources for every child, so it changed the amount of investment into, rather than having several kids and having minimal investment, you now had fewer kids and greater investment. And you started to see less labor, that there was no benefit to having lots of kids that you could put into the factories and the early textile mills that would provide that economic benefit to the family. And basically what we'd see is it becomes more expensive. People respond economically. It's interesting how economics play a role in virtually everything that we can look at. Public policy. The idea of things that were helping social programs. So in other words, people, as Malthus talked about, that you had people to care for some of these children, or programs that would support if there were children not getting the things they needed. Huge, especially in the lower classes, and protecting the early childhood. The women, as women started to contribute, as I mentioned, that and they became more educated, they were less likely to have huge families, and we're seeing that even today in the United States, where women are putting off having their first child later and later and later because they are highly educated. They are contributing, not quite on equal level in the sense of there's still the gender boundaries that exist. But in theory, we have the equality of race and gender, something at least we're striving for in terms of our society. But it's having a bigger role in society economically is huge, and having that control is a big factor in that. But in continuous, as if you notice, there's a slight decrease even in stage 3 of the death rates. And this is now we're looking at different factors that are going to be, that we know that we mentioned that we're already part of this in terms of sanitation, but now we add the medical revolution stuff, that we are looking at vaccines and procedures that allow people to live longer. We're understanding the idea of preventative health care, understanding that the basic things that not only the sanitation, but those healthcare issues that prevent early death. And so look what happens, if we look at today's survivorship in England or Great Britain, drastically different picture. And you can see what, we talk about the advancement society's made, what that actually looks like.